You're a condemned prisoner in Rome, 73 AD. The executioner drags you past the Colosseum into underground chambers. You think you're here to fight beasts. You're wrong. The crowd above cheers, but they can't see what's happening down here. What the Romans have planned will take hours, days even, and death will be the merciful part. The executioner smiles as he explains your fate. He's done this hundreds of times. He knows exactly how long each method takes, how much pain a human body can endure, how to keep you conscious through every moment. His tools are laid out like surgical instruments, each one designed for a specific type of agony. What you're about to experience isn't random cruelty. It's systematic, scientific. The Romans turned torture into an art form, with manuals, training programs, and specialized equipment. They studied pain, like scholars study mathematics. They documented which methods broke spirits fastest, which ones lasted longest, which ones made the strongest men beg for their mothers. You're one of thousands who will suffer these fates. The Romans didn't just execute criminals. They made examples, public spectacles designed to terrorize entire populations into submission. Every scream served a purpose. Every death sent a message. Tonight, we explore 6 methods that made the Roman Empire the most feared civilization in human history. And we start with the one that drove men insane before it killed them. Before diving into these stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. The Judas cradle looked innocent enough, just a pyramid-shaped wooden seat in the corner of the torture chamber. But this simple device represented Roman engineering applied to human suffering. The pyramid was precisely angled, too sharp, and death came too quickly, too blunt, and the agony wasn't sufficient. Roman craftsmen spent generations perfecting the measurements. Victims were stripped naked and positioned above the point. Ropes slowly lowered them until the pyramid tip pressed against their most vulnerable areas. Then gravity did the rest. Body weight forced gradual penetration. The pyramid was designed to pierce slowly, hour by hour, tearing tissue bit by bit while keeping vital organs intact. But here's what made it truly horrific. The device was positioned so victims could see their reflection in polished metal placed strategically around the chamber. They watched their own destruction, saw their blood pooling beneath them, witnessed their bodies betraying them as the pyramid worked deeper. The psychological torture began long before physical contact. Guards would bring condemned prisoners to watch others on the cradle. They'd describe in graphic detail what each stage felt like, how long previous victims had lasted, what sounds they made when the pyramid reached certain depths. The anticipation became part of the punishment. Different sizes existed for different body types. Roman engineers understood that one size couldn't deliver optimal suffering for all victims. Children required smaller pyramids. Large men needed specially reinforced bases. Women faced pyramids designed for their anatomy. Each victim received personalized agony. Records from Pompeii show specialized craftsmen who built these devices. They signed their work like artists, took pride in their precision. Some cradles featured adjustable mechanisms that could change the angle during use. Others had heated metal points that seared while they pierced. Innovation never stopped, but the Judas cradle was just the appetizer. What the Romans did in the amphitheaters was far worse. Wait until you hear what they did to Christian martyrs. Forget everything Hollywood taught you about crucifixion. The reality was infinitely worse. Movies show quick deaths with nails through palms. Historical accounts tell a very different story. Roman executioners were professionals who understood anatomy. They knew palms couldn't support body weight. The nails went through wrists. The space between wrist bones created a natural lock. Once driven through, the nail couldn't pull out no matter how much the victim struggled. Feet were nailed sideways through the ankles, not the top of the foot. This positioning forced victims into an unnatural crouch that made breathing nearly impossible. But it gets worse. Death came from asphyxiation, not blood loss. The position compressed the lungs. To breathe, victims had to push up on their nail-pierced feet. Every breath required excruciating movement. The pain was so intense that most passed out immediately. But survival instinct forced them awake. The cycle repeated for hours, sometimes days. Roman engineers designed different cross shapes for different effects. The traditional Latin cross was standard, but the T-shaped Tau cross forced different muscle groups to work harder. The X-shaped St. Andrew's cross spread victims wider, making breathing even more difficult. Each design served specific purposes in the theater of execution. Executioners added refinements based on crowd reaction. A small seat called a sedile could be attached to prolonged suffering. It supported just enough weight to prevent quick death, but not enough to provide real relief. Some crosses featured small platforms for the feet, forcing victims to choose between hanging by their arms or standing on wounded feet. Roman efficiency extended to mass crucifixions. After the Jewish revolt in 70 AD, they lined roads for miles with crosses. Specialized teams could crucify dozens per hour. They developed assembly line techniques. One team stripped and positioned victims. Another drove the nails. A third raised the crosses. Industrial-scale human suffering. The worst part was the timeline. Strong men could last 3 days. Women and children sometimes longer because their lighter weight put less strain on the wounds. Guards would break legs to accelerate death when the show needed to end. The sound of bones snapping could be heard throughout the amphitheater. But even crucifixion pales beside what the Romans did for entertainment. The next method was designed to make audiences cheer for human suffering. Damnatio ad bestias. 50,000 Romans packed the Colosseum to watch criminals fed to wild beasts. But this wasn't random violence. It was choreographed horror. Every detail planned to maximize both suffering and spectacle. The Romans understood that anticipation heightened entertainment value. Different animals served different purposes. Lions provided quick, dramatic kills that thrilled crowds with their speed and power. But bears were preferred for certain shows because they mauled rather than killed quickly. They would bat victims around like toys, breaking bones slowly while keeping them conscious. Wild boars were saved for special occasions because their tusks created spectacular wounds that bled freely. But it's only the beginning. Leopards were used when agility demonstrations were desired. These cats would leap and pounce repeatedly, never delivering killing blows. Victims would run in circles, bleeding from dozens of small wounds, while crowds cheered each leap. Some shows featured packs of wild dogs that worked together to bring down larger victims in coordinated attacks. The staging grew increasingly elaborate. Victims were dressed as mythological figures and placed in sets that told stories through torture. Someone condemned for theft might be dressed as Prometheus and chained to a rock while eagles ate their liver. The birds were trained to eat slowly, taking small bites to prolong the performance. Elaborate mechanical devices lifted and lowered victims to control the pace of animal attacks. Trapdoors opened beneath feet at precisely timed moments. Weighted nets dropped from above to entangle victims just as they thought they might escape. Every element was choreographed to build tension and release. Some victims were tied to stakes, but positioned so animals had to work to reach vital areas. Others were forced to run through mazes with hungry predators pursuing them. The mazes had dead ends and false exits designed to give hope before crushing it. Crowds cheered loudest when victims thought they'd found safety, only to discover another barrier. Professional animal handlers called bestiarii understood exactly how to maximize suffering duration. They knew which animals to starve beforehand and which to feed lightly to maintain aggression without reducing hunting instinct. They could predict how long each type of encounter would last and adjust accordingly. But wait, it gets worse. Children were thrown to animals for minor crimes like stealing bread. Parents were forced to watch from the stands. Some shows featured entire families executed together, starting with the youngest while others watched. The psychological torture of anticipation became part of the entertainment. Gladiators called damnati were sometimes assigned to wound but not kill condemned criminals. They would make precise cuts designed to weaken victims and make them easier prey for the animals that followed. Some gladiators specialized in techniques that maximized bleeding without causing immediate death. But the next method is probably one of the worst you've ever heard about. The boats wasn't originally Roman. It came from Persia. But the Romans perfected it like they perfected everything else. They took an existing torture method and applied engineering principles to maximize its effectiveness. What resulted was possibly the most horrific death imaginable. The victim was trapped between two boats, or wooden tubs, with only their head, hands, and feet exposed. The boats were positioned so the person couldn't move, but also couldn't die quickly. They were then force-fed honey and milk daily, not out of kindness. The sugary substances served a specific purpose in their destruction. But here's what makes it worse. The victim was forced to defecate and urinate in the confined space. Within hours, they were lying in their own waste. Then came the honey. Guards would cover the exposed flesh with honey and pour milk into their mouth. The combination attracted every insect in the area. Flies laid eggs in open wounds. Ants crawled over honeyed skin. Wasps came for the sweetness and stayed to sting. The timeline was the most horrific aspect. This wasn't a quick death. It could last weeks. The victim remained conscious through most of it because the daily feeding kept them alive. They watched their own body slowly rot, while insects consumed them alive. Maggots would hatch in wounds and begin eating rotting flesh while the person was still breathing. Roman physicians documented the process with clinical precision. They noted that gangrene typically set in around day 7. Delirium usually began by day 10. But victims could survive much longer depending on their constitution and the ambient temperature. Winter executions lasted longer because decay slowed in cold weather. The smell became unbearable within days. Guards had to rotate frequently because even hardened executioners couldn't tolerate the stench for extended periods. Some victims went blind from insect bites around the eyes. Others lost fingers and toes to rot while still conscious. The body consumed itself piece by piece, while the mind remained trapped inside. Roman innovations included heated metal elements added to the boats to accelerate certain types of decay. They experimented with different honeys to attract specific insects. Some execution sites were positioned near anthills or wasp nests to ensure immediate insect colonization. They documented which methods produced the longest survival times and which broke spirits fastest. One recorded case lasted 17 days. The victim began hallucinating on day 12 but remained conscious enough to beg for death until day 16. Another case involved a political prisoner who survived 19 days before succumbing. Romans kept meticulous records of these experiments for future reference. If you think that's the worst Rome could do, you're wrong. The next method was so horrific that emperors reserved it for personal enemies. The brazen bull looked like art. A beautiful bronze sculpture of a bull, perfectly crafted with intricate details. Museum visitors today might admire its craftsmanship, until they realized what the door in its side was for. This wasn't decorative art. It was a masterpiece of applied cruelty. The bull was completely hollow inside, large enough for a human body, but small enough to prevent comfortable positioning. Victims were placed inside through the side door, which was then sealed shut. A fire was lit underneath the bronze belly. The metal conducted heat perfectly. turning the interior into an oven that slowly roasted the occupant alive. But wait, it gets worse. The inventor, a man named Perillos, designed an intricate acoustic system inside the bull. Tubes and chambers transformed human screams into sounds that resembled a bull's roar. Different tones emerged based on the level of agony. The Romans treated it like a musical instrument. They would adjust the fire intensity to create different notes. The acoustic design was diabolically clever. As victims screamed, their voices echoed through carefully positioned chambers that changed the pitch and tone. To observers outside, it sounded like an angry bull rather than human suffering. This allowed audiences to enjoy the spectacle without confronting the reality of what they were witnessing. Emperor Phalaris commissioned the original bull and used it regularly for executions. He would invite guests to dinner parties, where the bull provided background music during meals. The timing was carefully controlled. Servants would adjust the fire to create crescendos during specific courses. The victim's agony became dinner entertainment. Different sizes were constructed for different victim types. Some bulls were designed for multiple occupants simultaneously. Others featured adjustable internal mechanisms that could change position during the roasting process. Roman engineers never stopped innovating when it came to human suffering. The bronze retained heat long after the fire was extinguished. Even dead victims continued cooking inside the bull. Some execution ceremonies lasted for hours as crowds gathered to hear the changing tones emerge from the bronze beast. Children were brought to these events as educational experiences about the consequences of defying Roman authority. Historical records show that Perillos himself became the first victim when he demonstrated the device to Phalaris. The tyrant appreciated the irony and had the inventor placed inside his own creation. Romans later adopted this as part of the bull's legend, using it to demonstrate that justice was inevitable, even for those who created instruments of injustice. But the absolute worst Roman torture method was saved for the most heinous crimes. What happened next defies human imagination. Poina coulae was reserved for patricides, those who killed their fathers. The Romans considered this the ultimate crime, a violation of the most sacred bond in their society. It required the ultimate punishment, something so horrific that even hearing about it would deter others from similar acts. The process began with the condemned being sewn into a leather sack along with live animals. Not just any animals. Each creature was chosen for specific symbolic meaning that amplified the psychological torture. A dog represented loyalty betrayed. A rooster symbolized family protection that had failed. A viper embodied the poison of betrayal. An ape mocked the humanity the criminal had abandoned. But the horror was just beginning. The animals would panic in the confined space. Dogs would bite anything they could reach. Roosters would claw and peck frantically. Vipers would strike repeatedly in their terror. Apes would scratch and tear with desperate strength, all while sewn together with the condemned person in a space barely large enough for a single human body. The psychological torture started before the animals were even added. Victims could hear each creature being placed in the sack. They understood what was coming. Some went insane before the sewing was completed. Guards would describe previous executions in vivid detail, explaining how each animal typically behaved and which parts of the body they usually attacked first. The completed sack was then thrown into a river or the sea. Death could take hours depending on animal behavior and water temperature. Some victims drowned quickly if they managed to position themselves to inhale water. Others survived much longer, being mauled by panicking animals while slowly suffocating in the submerged sack. But here's where it gets truly horrific. Sometimes the sack would wash ashore before the victim died. Surviving animals would continue attacking the still-living person on the beach. Romans would often recapture these survivors and repeat the entire process, treating survival as evidence that the punishment hadn't been sufficient. The symbolic meaning was as important as the physical torture. Romans believed that patricides had violated the natural order so completely that they deserved to die like animals. The sack represented a return to primordial chaos, where human civilization meant nothing. The mixed animal and human blood was considered necessary to cleanse the pollution caused by the original crime. Cicero documented several cases in his writings. He described one victim who somehow survived the initial drowning and made it to shore, only to be attacked by the surviving rooster and ape. The criminal lived for 3 more days on the beach, being slowly pecked and clawed to death while Roman citizens watched and refused to intervene. This method was used for over 600 years across the Roman Empire. Different regions developed their own variations. Coastal areas preferred sea execution, while inland territories used rivers. Some added additional animals based on local availability. All maintained the core principle that patricide required punishment that transcended normal human suffering. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.